So I do a segment on the Joey Zero Weekly Warframe show called Our Tip of the Week, where it's pretty self-explanatory. And last week, we did an Equinox-themed episode. Go check it out, link in the down there part. What fascinated me was that Joey and I have very different views of Equinox, while keeping in mind mostly the same builds for her. He framed Equinox as a frame that can do just about everything, largely all at once, whereas I talked about how Equinox's core flaw is that it's not really possible to build for many of her powers simultaneously. My perspective is that she's versatile in the arsenal, but not in a mission. She can do many powerful things, but not all at once. And since I found it so interesting and surprising to watch our opinions laid out side by side, I'm just going to talk about one of my Equinox builds and try to show you what I meant, how that might affect your buildcraft experiments with her, and how my view might be the product of my biases, as most views are. And fortunately, Joey Zero made a follow-up video where he showed off his Maim Equinox. Again, you know where to find that, go check it out. I'm going to show you my version of that Maim build. I really enjoy this type of friendly video conversation collaboration on YouTube, and I see very little of it, so here we go, let's change that. Joey, this is informally dedicated to you. Behold my Stance Dance Equinox. Maim is a really strong ability. It stores damage dealt to enemies in its area of effect while you're channeling it, and when you turn it off, it deals all that stored damage to everything in range. From my perspective, the problem with Maim is that it works best with a very specific kind of build that renders at least the other Dayform powers pretty much useless. With no powers whatsoever while charging up Maim, Equinox is completely vulnerable with no exceptional base stats to speak of, so it's hard for her to stay alive, although it's worth noting that Maim will fire off its damage for you automatically if you go down while charging it. Not saying you should do that, just saying. I'm going to explore a less self-destructive strategy than that. But I want to note how my own experience plays into this train of thought I'm talking about. So in Joey's video, he made a very important note that the build he showed was intended to be played with support from your squad in mind, like an organized squad. My own build philosophy falls somewhere a little closer to solo play. I usually build assuming a public, unknown squad. So, for example, you can assume maybe 1 or 2 corrosive projections, usually 1, which is good for Maim because it does slash damage but not a slash proc, but you can't assume full armor removal from some ability or all 3 corrosive projections. You will sometimes have all 3 or some ally removing armor with abilities, but I've spent over 1,000 hours in missions and I've only seen that happen without planning a small handful of times. You can also assume some simple stuff, like your team will probably be killing enemies and using some helpful abilities, you just don't know which ones, and you can't assume to be revived reliably, not every single time, so no self-destructive Maim activation playstyle. Anyway, what I'm getting at is that I'm assuming that you do need to put some effort toward keeping yourself alive, and when I took off my survivability stuff in this loadout, I did find it pretty inconsistent. But that can come down to playstyle, luck with matchmaking, and practice, so the functional difference to note is that Joey Zero's build uses the rest of the space to fix some of that negative strength, which makes Dayform's abilities kind of useful again, which could be worthwhile, especially if your survivability is taken care of. Since I prioritize getting some survivability in my build, in my hands, and Dayform's utility doesn't really help out with that, I'm going in a different direction at this point, and I hope it makes sense why both approaches could make sense. So the problem for me is that Maim encourages buildcraft that renders other Dayform powers useless, and they're not much help surviving anyway. Well, the way I conceptualize buildcraft, I do need some way to survive on my own, so even making the Dayform powers stronger, which is what Joey used the rest of the space in the build for, doesn't really help for my purposes. I need some way to make Equinox survivable and a way to defend her while we charge up Maim to get that value out of it. And Nightform has lots of defensive utility, we just can't get access to it immediately. But in Joey's video, he mentioned the energy transfer augment. So this is an augment for Mend and Maim that allows you to activate one and then swap to the other form while keeping it active. So that gives you access to rest while you're charging Maim. You can activate it in Dayform and then go into Nightform and use rest to crowd control everything and keep them from killing you while you charge up Maim. And luckily, the way that the stats spread works for Maim is also really good for rest. So range is helpful, so you put lots of enemies to sleep. Duration, so they stay asleep long enough that you don't need to sleep them again. And then a good enough amount of efficiency that we can spam it. Also, strength really doesn't do anything, which is good because we don't have any. Cool, now I can protect myself while charging up Maim. So I'll activate Maim in Dayform, dance on over to Nightform, spam rest on everything while Maim charges, and then swap back to Dayform when I want to murder the entire map by deactivating Maim. I still get shot, though, so I can't just assume healing from my squad. I need some source of sustain, and it would also be nice to have some supplemental energy. There's a bit of a risk with this style of play where if you activate Maim here, go over to Nightform, use rest a bunch of times, and then you don't have the energy to get back to Dayform and deactivate Maim, it won't go off. So even though Maim will blow itself up automatically if you go down, it doesn't go off automatically if you run out of energy while channeling it. So even though these abilities are pretty cheap, like the cost of all of this is not really that high, it's a bit more important that we always have enough energy, because if we don't, then all of the effort is totally wasted. So it's particularly important to sort of over-sustain our energy pool. Again, these are not expensive powers, but it's very important that we have enough to get back to Dayform to pop Maim. Again, going back to my buildcraft style, usually I build with my loadout in mind. So this Equinox build is made to be used with these weapons, or at least with similar weapons. So the Embolist, for example, is a kind of odd weapon, not a very exciting or powerful weapon. It's basically a toxin short-range Ignis that's a secondary weapon, and it has no crit stats to speak of. It does, however, have a ton of status chance, like way more status chance than you would normally need, and it also has a Red Veil Syndicate augment, which restores your energy when it goes off. I'm using the Embolist like a corrosive spray bottle to soften heavily armored enemies and destroy nullifier bubbles with its many packets of damage per second, since it's technically classified as a beam weapon, so that everything actually does die when I set off my charged Maim. You could even swap in Magnum Force to affect a larger area, albeit at a significant base damage loss. That's a bit more energy sustain. So for effective health, I added in Vitality and one Arcane Guardian set, which I feel like is enough. We're not gonna be that tanky. This is never gonna be that tanky, but we do want our health to be worth a bit more, and the ability to store more health points is definitely important because Equinox just has very unimpressive stores of health and shields. We don't have any way to mitigate damage to shields anyway, and we don't have a lot of space. It would be interesting to try to use health conversion here, but we're a bit tight on space. You could cut a bit of the range, but I don't know. So Vitality and Arcane Guardian give us a bit more effective health. Pretty big boost for the amount of space it costs. And then I'm going to be using a healing return melee. So basically, unlike the Embolist, which uniquely fulfills its role as a corrosive flamethrower that does over 10 procs per second to multiple enemies at once and also has an energy restoring syndicate power, again, pretty specific, the Hasselwar here could be quite a few different weapons. When you get these otherwise great weapons with terrible critical stats, you have a great opportunity to use Primed Reach and Healing Return. These are both good mods in their own right, and they're often good in hybrid weapons as well, but they're especially good on weapons with this kind of stat spread because you lose very little by running them. It's not really a trade-off the way it would be if you also had good critical stats. Otherwise, this is a normal melee build and it still does impressive damage. You'll notice that I've chosen to run Corrosive here. You could run Viral instead, and it kind of fits the more slash-focused spread of this weapon's damage a bit better, but I didn't do that because the Red Veil Syndicate proc also comes with a Viral status effect, so having Corrosive and Viral, more damage for Condition Overload, not a huge thing, but a little bit of bonus healing return as well. Brief note, though, that Melee 3.0 will possibly be removing Quick Melee, which is a strong point for polearms. They still have good stances, and I'd recommend Shimmering Blight, which I'm showing here, if that happens and you feel like you still want to use polearms, but you lost their nice Quick Melee. But if you want to pick something else, keep in mind that long range is important for this use case. You'll often want to heal off of enemies that are affected by rest, and if you don't have good range, you'll get stuck in prompted finisher animations and heal very slowly. With Healing Return, you want to be hitting many times to get many status effects and many packets of healing, so you want normal melee attacks. You'll heal much faster that way. Keep your distance and avoid finishers. Also note that slide attacks will allow you to avoid finishers at close range if needed. Whips are pretty good at that. That's my core loadout, but there are a few more things you can do. So Death Cube can serve as another source of sustain. It's a great fit because despite its utility, it's pretty squishy, one of the squishier sentinels, and my loadout is relying mostly on hard crowd control to survive. We're not focusing on being tanky, we're not really planning to wade through a bunch of enemies, so hard crowd control, that'll keep Death Cube from getting hit in the first place, which should keep it safe. Energy Generator and Synth Deconstruct pair up to create a loop where your Death Cube getting some hits on enemies before they die can give you energy orbs and health orbs, which will sustain you a lot. And that's perfect with Equinox's passive, which gives you a little bit of the other stuff every time you get either type of orb, kind of like a mini equilibrium effect. It's not much, but it does add up. To make sure that your Death Cube is actually getting assist credit on many enemies, I recommend this weird Sweeper Prime build. This basically just forgets about damage entirely, and it's focused on multi-shot. I even have a Riven with a little more multi-shot, which is not particularly necessary, but nice. And then it's got fire rate, reload speed, and punch through. This makes sure that the Sweeper's shots will punch through as many enemies as possible, and that wide pellet spread means you're likely to hit enemies that it's not aiming at as well, as a result of the punch through and the spread. I even added a little bit more spread to try to get a nice big shotgun blast, so as long as you run around the map, your Death Cube will tag many enemies for assist credit, and then when you use Maim, you'll often kill all those enemies it tagged and suddenly get a whole bunch of health and energy orbs. Do quickly note that the way that Energy Generator and Synth Deconstruct work is a bit different. So Energy Generator makes the Death Cube produce an energy orb, and Synth Deconstruct makes the enemies drop the health orb. So when you pop Maim and kill all those enemies your Death Cube tagged, your Death Cube will drop the energy orbs, but the bodies will have the health orbs on them, so you still want to keep running around to make sure you get all those health orbs, which remember will also give you energy, only a little bit, but it adds up. Finally, it's helpful to be able to do some damage yourself, of course. I brought my Thrown Damage Javlok build, full video on that in the description. It uses gas, so it wants corrosive projection, and I'm already bringing that. And I don't have to hold it for very long to get the damage out of it, which keeps me holding my Embolist for as much of the time as possible, so it can charge up with affinity, give me more energy, and fire out some viral procs. In fact, even the targets the Javlok hits will count for affinity toward the Embolist Syndicate power, which is an awesome little synergy since you swap to the Embolist immediately when you throw the Javlok. And the two synth mods on Death Cube will even automatically reload the Javlok while it's sitting on the ground. So this synth set will give you 10% of the magazine back every second while the weapon is holstered, but that actually means just while it isn't equipped. It doesn't have to be literally in your pocket. It can also be, let's say, on the ground. So when you throw your Javlok, you just leave it there, don't pick it up, and it'll reload itself. After a little while, you can pick it up and throw it again with a full charge, or you can pick it up immediately and throw it for weaker damage as much as you want. So this keeps it nice and versatile, doesn't make you waste a lot of time reloading the Javlok, and also offsets the sort of detriment of the Javlok build that I'm using, where we actually have pretty heavily reduced reload speed. Overall, while I don't consider Equinox much of a favorite of mine, or a particularly synergistic frame, I think it's easy to see how my personal approach to a loadout results in a very different final product than what Joey Zero showed off. These builds are built around the same ability, but they're aimed at different situations where you'd use that ability. I hope that showing my thought process allows you to kill your darlings and make builds that fit your needs, something that Joey and I both advocate really strongly for, but often have trouble demonstrating. Use both of our videos to create something that suits your playstyle. I feel like the best way to help people make their own builds is just to show them a lot of builds, so that's what we're going to do. Thanks for watching. I've been Zandy. Come back soon.